Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Spring 2018 STEM Scholars Lecture. I'd like to give special thanks to our sponsors. They are Capital Public Radio and the Office of Public Affairs at Sacramento State. One quick reminder, please check those cell phones now. We'd like them turned off or silent. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Amelia Vankeuren. She grew up in the Napa Valley right nearby, and when she was a youngster, she dragged around those irrigation pipes, and she gained an early appreciation for the value of water. Her passion for water and for international studies grew, and she went to the University of Southern California, where she double majored in geology and international relations. Following that, she spent a year in Kazakhstan as a Fulbright Fellow. So she has a very distinguished record. After that, she went on to earn her PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University, and followed that with a postdoc at the U.S. Department of Energy National Lab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She joined our faculty, and we're welcoming her back to Northern California. And since she's joined us, she has taught our hydrogeology classes at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. She has 3 projects that she's involved with and supporting students. One deals with groundwater under the Sac State campus. There's another one with groundwater levels down near the Cosumnes Preserve. And finally, a 3rd project that deals with arsenic releases into groundwater in the Central Valley. So she has a distinguished record, a long publication record, and she's also an excellent researcher. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Amelia Vankeuren.
All right, thank you, Dr. Horner, and thank you everyone for coming. Tonight, I'd like to talk with you about California's groundwater bank account and what we can do to keep this bank account solvent. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my funders and collaborators, scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, as well as myriad Sac State geology students who have helped with sample collection, lab analyses, data analysis, all kinds of stuff. I couldn't have done it without them. I'd also like to thank my funders, in particular the UC California Institute for Water Resources and the Sacramento State Research and Creative Activity Faculty Awards Program. Roadmap for the talk today. We'll begin by looking at the fundamentals of the groundwater bank account, then go into what I call direct deposit to the account, or natural groundwater recharge, and then finally look at saving for retirement, managed aquifer recharge. So California's groundwater bank account. Imagine needing to balance an account that is shared by millions of people, and these people can all deposit and withdraw money without letting you know. You have only a rough estimate of how much water started in this account. You have virtually no information about how much is being deposited or withdrawn, and the account is linked to that of your neighbor. Until recently, this was the situation for California groundwater. Until 4 years ago, when the legislature enacted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So now that we're trying to achieve groundwater sustainability, all of this uncertainty needs to change. We need to be able to quantify the inflows and outflows into this account in order to be able to make sure it stays in the black. So why is groundwater so important to California? Well, it provides 30% of our freshwater supply on a typical year, and in drought years, up to 60% of our water supply. As you all know, California recently emerged from a 5-year drought that was historic in scale. Well, the drought was bruising. It forced mandatory water cutbacks and caused several thousand wells in the Central Valley to go dry. We were fortunate in that no municipalities ran out of water. Everyone could still get a drink. This is not the case in Cape Town, South Africa, which is currently experiencing a 3-year drought. In Cape Town, the reservoirs are currently at historically low levels, and by July of this year, if the situation doesn't change, they're expecting to run out of water. In July, taps will shut off, People will have to go to distribution points, 200 distribution points for a city of 4 million, for people to get their 6.5 gallons of water per day, because that's the minimum amount allowed or required by the World Health Organization in times of emergency. So these are potentially dire circumstances and may cause a humanitarian crisis. So what's the difference between Cape Town, where things are so dire, and California, where we had a longer drought, but were able to survive it? The difference is groundwater. Groundwater has acted as the savings account for California in dry periods for many years. And in fact, for the last 100 years, California has been withdrawing groundwater at a rate faster than we have been depositing it. So we've been tapping into that savings account. So this is a plot showing the change in groundwater storage in millions of acre feet as a function of water year. And you can see that over time, for the last 100 years, the trend has been going down. So we are starting to lose our savings account. And this is potentially quite problematic because groundwater has been a stable water supply for California, and it helps offset the instability in our surface water supply. So this is a plot showing the precipitation coming into California over the last 100 years. And you can see that there's quite a lot of change year by year. So while we receive on average 22 inches per year, the minimum is just 10, and the maximum is over 40. So we have a 4-fold difference in incoming precipitation between dry years and wet years. That is a huge amount of variation. Imagine if you had that kind of variation in your paycheck. Imagine what your bank account would look like if you couldn't plan on how much money you had coming in any given year. It makes it very uncertain and hard to pay your bills, or in the case of California, could make it hard to supply people with water. In order to offset some of this uncertainty in precipitation, California has responded by building dams. So we currently have over 1,400 dams in the state with a cumulative storage of over 45 million acre feet. Now, an acre foot is sort of a weird unit, but it's beloved of hydrologists. It's the amount of water that it would take to fill 1 acre of land, which is about the size of a football field, with water 1 foot deep. It's also 326,000 gallons, and the amount of water that 1 to 2 families needs each year. So California relies on these dams to store surface water to get us through years where there's less precipitation. But these dams can only store enough water for about 3 years, at which point the reservoirs would be depleted if we did not have groundwater to back it up. California is also fortunate in that we have another reservoir, the frozen reservoir. So we have snowpack in the Sierra Nevada coming in on an annual basis, and that accounts for 42% of our annual storage. So this plot is showing how many million acre feet of water stored. Anything under the blue lines is stored in reservoirs, and the green peaks are snow. So in a typical year, we have 24 million acre feet of water stored in reservoirs and an additional 17 in snowpack, 42% of the annual water storage in snowpack. And this is critical because the reservoirs fill early in the winter and spring when we have high precipitation in California. We receive 50% of our precipitation between December and February. 90% of California's precipitation is between October and April. But we need that water to last all year long. So the reservoirs store it temporarily, we fill them in the winter, and then as we get into late spring, early summer, we start using that water for irrigation, moving it down south to provide irrigation for crops in the Central Valley. It also supplies drinking water. So as we start to deplete those reservoirs going into summer, that's when the snow melt starts to kick in, and it replenishes the reservoirs midway through the year. So we rely on that snowpack to add additional storage. The problem is that with climate change, snowpack is becoming more and more uncertain. We are currently in a year where we have only 50% of our expected snowpack for the time of year, and unless we get a number of big storms, we're looking at below average snowpack. So below average water supply for the year. After last year, where we had a deluge, it seemed like we were in the clear, at least for surface water, but just one dry year can shift things immensely. And with climate change, that snowpack will be less consistent. So this is showing temperature in California over time. The green line is the average temperature between 1949 and 2005. This is a good baseline value. And you can see that from 1980 on, there's a steadily increasing trend. California is getting warmer, as is the rest of the world with climate change. So as California gets warmer, more and more of our precipitation will come in the form of rain, not snow, which means that we have less snowpack to begin with. And what snowpack we do have will start to melt earlier because it's warmer, and it will melt faster, which means that instead of providing a gradual supply to the reservoirs over time throughout the summer, the snowpack will be gone earlier in the year, and we won't have that later in the year replenishment of the reservoirs. So, with the increasing uncertainty of surface water supply from climate change, groundwater becomes an even more important portion of California's water supply. Another issue with climate change is the extreme weather events. As we just learned, going from 5 years of drought into a year of deluge and now back to a dry year, these swings are going to get more and more common, which means that we really need a stable supply of water. And that is groundwater. Groundwater is also great because it has a much larger storage potential than surface water. So the Department of Water Resources in California estimates that groundwater can store up to 1 billion acre-feet of water, which is about 20 times more than our reservoirs. So groundwater could potentially be a much larger storage supply for prolonged periods of drought. But first there has to be groundwater in the system. So there's already some existing groundwater storage, and there's some open space where more groundwater could be accommodated if we had water to put down there. One of the problems with groundwater is that for the last 100 years, as we were depleting that savings account, the groundwater was not well kept track of. So we had 100 years essentially of neglect of groundwater. We treated it as an unlimited resource. People pumped however much they needed to offset any declines in surface water supply. And as a result, when we hit the drought and groundwater levels were pumped even more, we started seeing wells go dry in the Central Valley. And that finally spurred California to enact the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, 100 years after the legislation governing surface water. So for the last 100 years, we had no regulation of groundwater, even though we had already acknowledged that water is a shared resource and needed to be preserved. So now we're finally getting with the picture and looking to develop groundwater sustainability. This is a map showing different sub-basins within California. There are 127 different basins that are divided into high and medium priority basins. So these are ones that supply significant numbers of people, and many of them have less groundwater coming into them than is getting used. So they are getting depleted. So all of these basins now have to provide groundwater sustainability plans within the next 2 to 4 years and reach groundwater sustainability 20 years after that. So this is a tall task for the state, but there are lots of people working very hard at it. And each of these basins is under local control, so local groups are figuring out how best to achieve groundwater sustainability for their basin. But what does groundwater sustainability mean? So groundwater sustainability is avoiding undesirable effects like subsidence, groundwater significant declines in groundwater, impacts between surface water and groundwater going away. To simplify it though, groundwater really just means trying to balance an account. So it's like our bank account. As long as the inflows and the outflows match, your balance stays the same. The problem is, when you start taking more out of the account than you're putting in, you start to decrease your balance. Or if you're really responsible, you're taking out less than you're putting in, and you start to grow your balance. You have more for the future. So to achieve sustainability, we need to at least have our inflows and outflows matched, or ideally have more coming in than we're taking out. But we don't even know how much is coming into the groundwater system, or how much is going out. So because of those 100 years of no regulation where people were pumping, there was no meter on those wells. So for most people, Sacramento is finally getting meters installed on most houses. You have water coming into your house, there's a meter on the side of your house that is tracking the inflows, and you get charged for this by your utility provider. Groundwater, because it's mostly managed by domestic or agricultural wells, was not metered in this way. So we have no record of how much water was coming out. And in fact, estimates for how much groundwater is used were usually developed by looking at the land use. So looking at what crop is planted on the land, figuring out how much water that crop usually requires, and then taking the difference between how much surface water was coming in and how much water that crop needed to calculate how much groundwater must have been added. This is a very inefficient way of looking at the groundwater bank account. So there's a lot of work to be done to try to figure out now how much is actually coming into the system and how much is going out. And that needs to happen very rapidly because these sustainability plans, as I mentioned, are supposed to go into effect in 2 years, which means that they had at most 5 years to collect data on groundwater that had been neglected for over 100. So this is a daunting task. Which brings us to my work and my team's work on actually calculating some inflows into the groundwater system. So to begin with, we're going to look at my project looking at Sacramento State aquifers as a proxy for direct deposit. So these are natural groundwater recharge that's occurring without us having to do anything. We just sit back, money is deposited in the account on a regular basis, and we get to enjoy it. But we still need to know how much is coming in so we can figure out how much water we can take out. So we're going to look at a few things. First, who is making these deposits? Where is the water coming from? When are these deposits made? So when is water added to the aquifer? And how much is getting added to the account? So at what rate is water getting added? So to begin with, looking at where the water is coming from. There are 2 different natural sources for groundwater addition. The first is just precipitation on the land surface. So rain falls and it infiltrates into the soil and then down into an aquifer. And the next is a losing stream, where you have water flowing through a river and the river bottom is not impermeable, so some water percolates down through the river into the aquifer. And this is very common in California, where many of our major streams are sourced from the western Sierra Nevada, carrying that snowmelt down to the valley floor. And Sacramento State is bounded by one of these rivers. So the Lower American River is our eastern boundary of campus. And Sacramento State is lucky because we have one of the largest on-campus well fields in the nation. So we have 20 wells that are tapping 2 separate aquifers. There's 1 pumping well and the rest are monitoring wells. So these red dots are showing the locations of our wells, and there are multiple wells in each of these locations. So at the blue dots, there are paired wells, 1 in the shallow aquifer, 1 in the deep aquifer, and at the red dots, there are 4 different wells ranging in depth from 25 feet to 200 feet. So we have a unique opportunity to study in great detail the recharge from the Lower American River and precipitation into our campus aquifers. So we'll look at this as a case study for how you can characterize inflows into a groundwater basin, and then you can think about how much work will be involved in doing this for the entire state of California. So this is a cross-section for the Sacramento State Campus well field. We have the Lower American River on the east, and then a levee, which is used primarily for flood control, and is also reinforced by a slurry wall. So this is a concrete wall in the middle of the levee that is designed to prevent water from the river from going through the levee and into the groundwater system. Because when you get flow through a levee, it creates a pathway, more water flows through there, you get erosion and potentially levee failure. So this wall is designed to prevent water flow. On the other side, we have the groundwater system with our shallow, unconfined aquifer, a confining layer of something impermeable like clay, and then below that, a confined aquifer. So in order to characterize this system and calculate how much water is coming in, we did groundwater sampling from all of these wells, and then geochemical characterization of the water. We also measured water levels in order to figure out the direction of flow. So again, these are Sacramento State students and Lawrence Livermore scientists all collecting data on the Sac State groundwater system. So our first findings showed that groundwater in both aquifers flows to the southwest, away from the Lower American River. So this suggests that the river is having an impact on the groundwater system. And then we can use geochemistry to actually tag the water and figure out its source. So this plot is showing stable isotopes in water, which are just a way of looking at water and its source. So the hydrogen and oxygen in the water will be potentially different weights depending on where the water came from. So our local precipitation in Sacramento plots in the upper right-hand corner, and the Lower American River plots in the lower left. And so anything plotting close to the American River is probably sourced by that, whereas the wells on this line here are probably coming from more local precipitation. And you can see there's sort of two groupings here. So we have wells that have a mixture of local precipitation and river water, and then also wells that are primarily fed by the river. So this is interesting, and now we want to dig in and see why different wells are fed by different sources. So if we look at the percent river water, so using those isotopes, we can figure out how much of the water in a particular well was sourced by the river. And look at the fraction river water as a function of depth. We can see again that there are groupings. So all of the wells in the confined aquifer are sourced primarily from the American River. They're between 80 and 100% American River water. And all of the water coming from wells in the shallow aquifer that are close to the river are also primarily river water. So that makes sense. The wells closer to the river have more river water. And the shallow wells farther from the river are sourced by much more local precipitation. So that suggests the impact of the river on the aquifer starts to decline with distance. We can also see the impact of the river on the aquifers by looking at the water level elevation. So this is just the level of water in the wells compared to the river stage. So when the river is higher, the wells are higher. So there is a hydrologic connection between the river and the wells. So this is showing that even though there's a slurry wall and a confining layer, somehow that river water is still communicating with the aquifer, and the water is in fact able to flow through the system. So these are both wells in the confined aquifer, that deeper one, at different distances. Doesn't seem to matter, the river still has an impact. If we look at shallow wells, unfortunately we had a bit of a pressure transducer error, so we have a bit of a gap in data. But looking at the green line here, this is the shallow well closest to the river, and it still has similar valleys, and there's a little peak here that suggests that it is also communicating with the river. Whereas a shallow well much farther from the river has a different trend. So the impact of the river has declined. You can also see the effect of irrigation. So all of the noise in this green line is the campus irrigation well that is adjacent to our monitoring well switching on and off. So you can definitely see that campus is irrigating heavily from, or maybe not heavily, but is at least irrigating during the summer months, whereas in the spring months, when there's more surface water available, there's much less pumping going on. There's much less noise in the curve. Okay, so all that shows that most of the water in the aquifers is coming from the river. So now we know where the deposits are coming from. But when are those deposits getting made? When is water getting added to the aquifer? So to look at that, we collected samples for dissolved noble gases. So these are gases that are naturally in the atmosphere and dissolve into water, and how much they dissolve in depends on the temperature of the water. So the colder the water is, the more gas you have. And so you can tell the temperature that the water was at the time it entered the aquifer. So if we compare the temperature of water when it entered the aquifer, which ranges from 12 to 16 degrees Celsius, to the temperature in the Lower American River, which is this black curve, we can calculate the primary time of the year that we're getting recharge. And so those temperatures, 12 to 16 degrees, correspond to the river during the months of April to July. So most of the water coming into the aquifer is during the late spring and into the summer. This is interesting because, as I pointed out, California precipitation mostly comes between December and February. So if this were a natural river, like the Cosumnes River in the south, you would expect peak flows to be earlier in the year, and then you would expect your groundwater recharge to be earlier in the year. But because the American River is a dammed river, if we look at its discharge by month, the peak discharge is not in December to February when most of the rain is coming in. It's in fact in the summer when more water is being released from the dam in order to provide water to go to the Central Valley Project, so water for irrigation, and also to drive the salt wedge out of the delta to keep fresh water at the pumps taking the water down south. So because the Lower American River is a managed aquifer, is a managed river system, it has shifted the recharge timing to the groundwater system. And because it's a managed system, that means that we're also going to have groundwater recharge even in times of drought. So this is a plot showing river discharge. Blue is the American River, green is the Cosumnes, as a function of date. This is through the drought years. So the Cosumnes River had short, high peaks in the winter, and then in some years, not even particularly high peaks. But the American River consistently had flow through the summer in order to maintain flow standards for environmental reasons, like for fish, and to continue providing water for irrigation and for driving out that salt wedge. So even in years of drought, there is still water release, which means there is still going to be recharge to the groundwater system. So we know the water is coming from the river. We know it's coming mostly during the summer, but how much water is actually coming into the groundwater system? So to figure out the rate of groundwater addition to the system, we look at groundwater age. So shown here is the mean groundwater age of a sample from a well as a function of well depth. So first of all, you can see for the relatively shallow wells, the water is pretty young, less than 10 years. And as you go down in depth, you also increase in age. So water gets older as it gets deeper. So using those groundwater ages, we can actually calculate a groundwater flux and figure out that the recharge from the land surface, so this is from precipitation, is between 0.3 and 0.7 feet per year. And we can also look at flow rates based on the hydraulic gradient between wells near the river and farther from the river, and calculate a recharge rate of 24 feet per year. So this is in the shallow aquifer system. In the deeper aquifer, age does not increase with depth, but it increases along a horizontal flow path. So going from the northeast corner of campus, groundwater gets progressively older as you move along. So yellow water, or the yellow regions, are water that was recharged about 60 years ago, whereas water in the northeast corner was only recharged maybe 10 years ago. So water gets older along the flow path, and we can use those ages to calculate the recharge rate. So based on the distance from the river and the age of the groundwater, we can calculate the water is definitely getting older with distance, and we can calculate a rate of 11 feet per year. So if we now combine all of these pieces of data from the shallow system and the deep system, we can calculate how much water is actually coming into the system. So in the shallow system, where we have recharge from precipitation, just multiplying our rate by the surface area of campus, we get about 100 acre-feet per year coming in. And from the river, we get about 500 acre-feet per year. So it's a faster flow rate, but a smaller area of interaction with the river than the surface area of campus. So we get about 5 times more water added to the system from the river in the shallow system. And then in the deep system, we're getting water at a rate of about 50 acre-feet per year. So cumulatively, we have 650 acre-feet per year coming into campus. So those are our inflows into the campus groundwater bank account. But I haven't talked at all about outflows. And this is because that is an entirely different project, and I'd need another couple of years on that one. So inflows are all we have for now. But this is the complicating factor for the California groundwater system. We had so little data for so long that now we're having to scramble to figure out what is actually coming in and going out. So to summarize, for the Sac State system, the unconfined aquifer is recharged by a mixture of local precipitation and river water. The confined aquifer is recharged mostly by the American River. That recharge is coming mostly in the summer, and the river provides about 85% of groundwater on campus. So that was one tiny little portion of a subbasin, and that's one subbasin out of 127 in the state. So you can get a sense for the scale that's going to be required to figure out how much water we actually have coming into the groundwater account. And as I mentioned, the basins, the accounts are tied to their neighbors. So each basin's inflow needs to match their neighboring basin's outflow. So they not only have to come up with a calculation for their own basin, but they have to make sure their calculation matches their neighboring basin's calculation for communication between the two. So this is a very complicated task and is employing a lot of hydrogeologists. Okay, so those are natural inflows. Now let's look at what we can do to increase water in the groundwater system and maybe put a little savings for retirement in our groundwater account. So one of the problems is that we've been depleting groundwater over the years, which suggests that we don't have extra water just lying around. So if we're already strapped for water, how do we save some for later? How do we get more water down into the aquifers? And is what we do going to be enough to prevent groundwater bankruptcy? So starting off with, where can we find some extra water to add to our groundwater savings account? There are a couple potential options. The first is pretty basic. It is, don't use the groundwater when you don't have to. It's called conjunctive use. So as long as there is surface water available, you use the surface water. So this sometimes means hooking up systems that were reliant on entirely groundwater to a surface water conveyance system. So if you had a farm and you only could pump water out of the ground, maybe we connect you with a pipe to a surface water system, so during wet years you can choose to not switch on your groundwater pump. Another one is using recycled water. So domestically, we have water coming into our house. We use it to wash our dishes, shower, flush the toilet, and then that water gets treated and usually just put into the river and it goes out to the bay. But what if instead of letting that river go out, we treat it and we re-inject it into the groundwater system? And this is actually already happening. Orange County has been doing this for a long time, and recently the Silicon Valley Advanced Water Purification Center, as part of the Santa Clara Water District, has started doing this. So I was lucky enough to tour their plant last year, and they have advanced filtration and purification systems like oxidation and using ultraviolet light to kill any microbes, and reverse osmosis to remove any impurities from the water. So what you wind up with is wastewater becoming very, very clean water that you can then use for other purposes. And another potential source of water is stormwater runoff. So last year we had really high flows in our rivers because it was one of the wettest years on record. So if we could harvest those high flows during the wet years and store them as groundwater, then they would be available during the dry years. And desalination is another potential source of water, but it's very expensive. It requires a lot of energy, whether you're distilling water or pushing it through a reverse osmosis membrane. So based on current water prices, it's usually not competitive. But so these are all potential options for adding water to the system. So the next question is, even if we have the water available, how do we get it down into the aquifers? So one of the ways is direct injection. We have wells to pull groundwater out of the system. We can also have wells to push other water into the groundwater system. It has to be clean water so you don't gunk up your well, but it's certainly feasible, usually on the more expensive side. And then there are other options that involve surface spreading of water that are called managed aquifer recharge. So this includes dry wells, which is basically digging a hole through an impermeable layer in order to allow water to be able to access the groundwater system. It involves spreading basins, so having areas of ground where it's highly permeable, where you spread water out and you allow it to then percolate into the groundwater, and off-season irrigation of crops, which is another project that I'm involved in. So off-season irrigation is just what it sounds like. It's putting water on crops when they're not growing and they don't need the water. So in the summer, when you irrigate crops, the plant needs the water, the roots pull that water towards the plant uses it and transpires, the water is lost to the atmosphere. But in the winter, when the plants don't need the water, if you flood the fields, the water does not get taken up by the plants, which means that it instead percolates down and eventually can reach the water table and add to the groundwater account. So the project that I'm working on is looking at off-season irrigation of vineyards along the Cosumnes River corridor. So here we are in Sacramento. The Cosumnes River flows to the south of us, and the area that I'm working on is just outside of Wilton. It's east of Elk Grove. And this project has a number of collaborators. The Omachumney-Hartnell Water District received a grant from the state to pay for the irrigation project, which is being carried out by an environmental consulting company. UC Davis Hydrology is responsible for installing some pressure transducers that will help us monitor the water level elevation. And the Cosumnes Coalition, which is a group of various nonprofits who are interested in restoring flows in the Cosumnes River. So currently, in the summer, the Cosumnes often goes dry because it's a losing stream, It's not managed by dams, which means that the water flows when it's available, but it percolates down to the groundwater, and often in the summer there are stretches that are dry, which makes it very difficult for salmon and steelhead to make it back up the river, because in the fall, when it would be a good time for spawning, sometimes the river is still not at the flows that it should be. So they're interested in restoring groundwater levels in order to restore flows in the river. So the project will involve off-season irrigation of 3 different plots of land, shown in red, blue, and yellow on the map. The first one will be this larger one, 785 acres on vineyard. So the plan is to recharge between 4,000 and 6,000 acre feet per year for the next 10 years. So this is a long-term project. Irrigation will occur between November and March, when there's excess water in the Cosumnes River and when the vines are not yet actively growing. But, of course, the amount we can actually recharge is going to depend on water availability. So we had hoped to start irrigating this year, but because it's been a dry year, there's actually not excess water in the Cosumnes to allow for diversion. So we can only do off-season irrigation when there's excess surface water. And the Sac State portion of this project will be monitoring groundwater quality and quantifying how much additional groundwater we are adding to the system. So how much are we putting away for retirement? So one of the issues with off-season irrigation is that croplands often have been used for many years and have legacy pesticides or nutrients, fertilizers in the soil. So then when you flood that soil, you can mobilize those contaminants and carry them down to the groundwater. So one question is that going to impact the groundwater quality? Now, one possibility is that you flush whatever contaminants in the soil, you flush them out when you first start irrigating, and then after that you keep adding water. So even though you add some contaminants, you also then add a lot more water, and so they become diluted, and it does not affect the groundwater quality. But we need to verify that. We need to make sure that by adding water to the system, we're still keeping the water usable, because it doesn't help to have more water if it's then contaminated. And then also quantifying the additional water storage. So how much water is added to the aquifer, and once it gets down there, where does it go? Because the Cosumnes is a divide. You've got a cone of depression around Elk Grove to the west and Galt to the south. So when you're paying to recharge water to an aquifer, you usually want to get some sort of benefit out of this. Either you want to be able to use the water later yourself, or you want compensation for your efforts by whoever else is going to be using the water. So a key aspect of groundwater banking, which is another term for this aquifer recharge, is being able to quantify how much water is going down there and then who uses it later so you can charge them for it. Okay, so now the question is, we have these methods for potentially enhancing groundwater. Will it be enough to prevent groundwater bankruptcy? So as I've mentioned, for the last 100 years, we've been withdrawing groundwater at a rate much more rapid than it has been replenished. Our withdrawals have exceeded our deposits. So can we change that? Can we do enough managed aquifer recharge to offset that continual overdraft? So this map is showing locations in California which are good candidates for managed aquifer recharge. So these are areas where the ground is permeable enough to allow infiltration of water down into the groundwater system. And the kind of yellowy green ones down here are the best areas. So there are areas of California that are definitely good candidates for managed aquifer recharge, but they're mostly in Southern California. And this is a problem because most of the water is in the north. So this is a map showing precipitation in California, and these green areas up here are areas of high precipitation. Red and orange is areas of low precipitation, low surface water availability. So the areas that are best for recharge are not where we have water, which means we'd have to have a lot more infrastructure to move more water down to Southern California to recharge the groundwater, which would be potentially quite expensive. Another thing to look at is how much water is actually available. So UC Davis Group has quantified how much water there is in times of high flow, how much water you could potentially harvest from stormwater and put towards use in groundwater. And they calculated 2.7 million acre feet of water each year, on average, in the Central Valley. So that sounds like a lot. We're in the millions of acre feet. If we could recharge all of that, that would add 6% to the annual groundwater supply, or to the annual water supply in general. But that is also the same volume of water that California has been in annual overdraft for historic periods. So that means that in order to offset that overdraft, we would have to take every drop of that excess river water and store it as groundwater, which is probably not practical. There are infrastructure requirements. You have to be able to transport the water to those areas of recharge. So our Casumnes project is costing over $1 million, and it's actually a quite low budget project because the vineyard is right next to the river. There were already pumps in the river designed to take river water and bring it up to the vineyard, so there was much less infrastructure than would ordinarily be required. So in order to try to harvest those 2.7 million acre feet and put them in the ground, it would be very expensive. So there may be areas where it's cheaper to do it, and we should certainly pursue that. But what this means is that in order to balance the groundwater bank account, we need to lower groundwater demand as well as increase groundwater supply. We can't just increase the inflows in order to get the balance stable. We have to decrease those outflows. So options for this include conjunctive use, so leaving the groundwater in the ground when we can. Conservation, so turning off your tap when you're washing your hands and brushing your teeth, taking shorter showers, not leaving the water running while you're doing things like washing your car, which the legislature is trying to ban now anyway. All of those mandatory restrictions on wasted water during the drought they're trying to make permanent. Things like drought-resistant landscaping. So that can also help. Actually, a good portion of the urban water use is in landscaping. And then on the agricultural side, shifting crops from high water demand, really thirsty crops like alfalfa and almonds and rice to less thirsty crops like tomatoes and onions and pomegranates. But of course, these are hard decisions to make. People's livelihoods are often involved, and so there's not a one easy plan for saving the groundwater account. It will require sacrifice on all parts. So overall conclusions, California has historically neglected groundwater regulation, which has allowed our groundwater banking account to be drawn into the red. With climate change, surface water availability is becoming even more uncertain, which means that groundwater is becoming a more important part of California's water supply. To balance that account, we really need to know what the inflows and outflows are, which means a big push to collect data on groundwater system throughout the state. There are some environmental tracers that can help with that, and so I'm sure that there will be lots of consultants and academic teams working to quantify inflows and outflows to the groundwater system over the next few years, and then to continue monitoring in order to maintain, in order to ensure that we actually are attaining sustainability. We can increase deposits through managed aquifer recharge, but in the end, the groundwater withdrawals will have to be reduced in order to preserve groundwater as a resource for future years. And we will really need that resource in drought years, which may become more common. Thank you for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So I noticed on campus over the last couple of years, they've landscaped in surface water recharge sinks. Did you notice any impact from that in your on-campus wells?
Yeah, so the question was, I'm guessing about those low impact development sites? Yeah, so the Office of Water Programs on the Sacramento State campus installed low impact development stormwater systems. So these are called bioswales. What they are is a depression on campus where surface water can collect, and then it flows through specialized material that's designed to filter out contaminants that you often find in urban runoff, so things like metals coming from buildings. And so these are also designed to increase percolation then into the groundwater system. Unfortunately, these were installed just about the time I arrived on campus, so I don't have data prior to them. So the question was, have they impacted the groundwater system? I would guess that they have, but unfortunately, I don't have data to back that up. Yes?
You talk about subsidence, in particular, San Joaquin County, and then how surface water may, the collection of surface water may help in the long run with groundwater recharge.
Mm-hmm. So the question was relating to subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley and surface water, sorry, the last.
Surface water impoundments for ultimate groundwater recharge.
Okay, yeah, surface water impoundments relating to groundwater recharge. So first addressing subsidence. So subsidence is the land surface actually getting decreased in elevation, so the land sinking because you're pumping out groundwater. So as you remove groundwater from the system, that space where the water was starts to, as you remove the water, the sand grains or the clays actually are the ones that often subside, start to compact. So the water had been sort of helping hold particles apart, and as you remove that water, the grains compact and you lose land surface. So there are areas of California where we've seen many feet of subsidence, and actually in the last drought, there were areas where subsidence was occurring at a rate of about a foot per year, which is quite extreme, and this can cause problems with things like building foundations and in San Joaquin Valley, actually with the water conveyance. So there are large aqueducts carrying water from Northern California to the Southern Central Valley, and then other ones carrying it on to Los Angeles. And those aqueducts are based on a very slight grade. So if you start to subside one portion, then you lose that very well-engineered grade and you stop being able to transport water. So subsidence is certainly a big problem. It has actually reduced somewhat with the advent of these surface water projects carrying water down, because when you take surface water from somewhere else and you use it for irrigation, that actually becomes a groundwater recharge source, because usually irrigation is not 100% efficient. You put water on a field, the crops use some of it, but there's some excess water that then percolates down into the groundwater. So inadvertently, through irrigation, using surface water from Northern California, so for instance, the Shasta and Oroville reservoirs, you can actually recharge groundwater in the southern portion of the state using that water through irrigation, through inefficient irrigation. So actually that's an interesting misconception. Drip irrigation is much more efficient, and people often think that that's a great way to conserve water. But if you start applying drip irrigation, then the water is used much more efficiently and less makes it down to the groundwater. Also, most farmers are not going to say, well, great, I can do this more efficiently, which means that I don't need as much water as I was taking before. Nope, they're just going to plant more trees. So they're going to continue using all the water. It's going to be used more efficiently by their crops, which means that the groundwater system actually suffers. And then for surface impoundments, I guess for managed aquifer recharge, that's just another mechanism of bringing water to the groundwater. Yeah.
Aside from agriculture, what are some other large sources of groundwater withdrawal in California?
So agriculture is the main user of water. In California, it accounts for 80% of water use. Other sources of groundwater use are municipalities. So actually, water districts providing water to cities often are pumping water, and other industries. But agriculture is definitely the biggest. Yeah.
So in Cape Town, people who can afford it right now are drilling wells to supply themselves with water.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of controls or regulations are there in California regarding people sinking wells and pulling water out as they feel like?
So the question was relating to Cape Town, where currently people are drilling wells in order to tap groundwater, so there is water available as the surface water is gone, and asking about regulations for well drilling in California in order to prevent people from doing the same. So when water supply is short, just drilling a bunch of wells and essentially tapping the groundwater even more. So well restrictions in California are done on a local basis, often at the county level. So it depends on whether or not the county you live in has regulations on well installation. So some locations, I grew up in Napa County, and they have defined water deficient zones where essentially you can't use more water than was historically used in that location. So you couldn't just sink a well to tap more water. But there are other counties that are a little more lax. So it really depends. It's a local case-by-case basis. Yes?
Can you address the question of the validity of the withdrawal logs and who's generating those logs? Well logs. Well logs.
Well logs?
Groundwater logs.
So most of these calculations are not actually from specific well logs.
Generally throughout California.
You mean looking at groundwater use? Like how much water is reported?
Exactly.
So I can't speak to, the question was on the validity of people's reporting of groundwater use. I can't speak to that. That would be, again, up to the local agencies to verify water use. As part of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's requirements for groundwater monitoring, which means that you can track the groundwater levels, and you should be able to back out to some extent how much water is actually being used, and then you could try to validate whether that matches what people are reporting. Yeah.
Moving forward, what kind of environmental traces can be used, or other methods can be used to determine the groundwater inflow throughout the whole state?
Yeah, so the question was on which environmental tracers are going to be useful for looking at groundwater inflows throughout the state. And that will, to some extent, depend on the location. So how old the water is means you have to use different tracers. So we used tritium and helium-3 dating in order to date the groundwater, but that only works for waters up to about 60 years old. So if you're looking at older water, then you have to start using radiocarbon, carbon-14 dating, and other potential tracers that are more recent are things like chlorofluorocarbons. So as we put things into the atmosphere that weren't there before industrialization, that makes us able to identify water that has been recharged since those things have been introduced to the atmosphere. So those are actually potentially useful tracers. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the areas in California that are candidates for managed aquifer recharge potential are in the south, but most of the availability of water is here in the north. Would you suggest that Governor Brown's Delta tunnels are the best option for moving and transporting that water down to the south?
So the question was if the governor's Delta tunnels are the best option for transporting water from the north to the south for things like managed aquifer recharge. The tunnels are certainly a contentious project. There are strong supporters on either side. I can't speak to whether or not they are the best way for transporting water. I will let that be figured out by the heads of state. Yeah.
What about reservoirs? We funded 2 reservoirs, or saying let's build Sites Reservoir. Will that solve our problems?
Yeah, so the question is, will new reservoirs solve our storage problems? So one of the problems in California is that we already built reservoirs on all the spots that are cheap and easy and supply lots of storage space. So the building of new reservoirs provides really incremental amounts of storage. So they can be potentially useful in local situations, but they're not going to add substantially to our already pretty maxed out 45 million acre feet of reservoir storage space. So the short answer is no, new reservoirs will not save us. So hence groundwater storage becoming a more viable option. Yeah.
As it relates to the site reservoir, would that have a local impact on groundwater? Would it locally make a significant difference in the groundwater situation?
The question is on the site's reservoir impact on local groundwater, and I'm not familiar with how exactly the water will be used, so I'm not sure. Sorry. Yeah.
When it comes to the crops during the recharge seasons, have you seen any affected, like fungal or anything affecting the crops during the normal summer?
So the question was, what happens to the crops during off-season irrigation if this causes damage to the crops like fungus? So there are ongoing studies of that. This is a pretty new field. So UC Davis, Helen Dalka is very active in this. She looked at alfalfa and essentially tried to flood it, to figure out how much flooding it would take to kill the alfalfa, and was unsuccessful because the stuff was just hardy and didn't seem to care. So there are certainly crops where there doesn't seem to be any negative impact. With things like vineyards and almonds, that's an ongoing source of study. So one of the aspects will also be looking at yield, because if you increase the groundwater recharge, but then you harm your crop harvest, then that potentially negates your benefits. So that's definitely something that's also being looked into. All right, maybe 2 last questions.
You calculated how much the groundwater recharges with the Sac State aquifers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you said, well, we don't know how much is actually being pulled out of those. Do you have any estimate of just in how much water Sac State uses for irrigation and just to run all the buildings? And where does Sac State get most of its water? Is it surface or groundwater?
So the question was about Sac State's water source. Since I looked at inflows to the groundwater system in Sac State, how is that water used and how much? So Sacramento State, the drinking water and all of the domestic water is actually supplied from surface water, which is the case for most of Sacramento. So there are water treatment plants. The Fairbairn Water Treatment Plant is just across the street from campus, pulls water from the American River. There are also wells at that treatment plant for backup supply, but the primary water supply for Sacramento State is surface water. But there are groundwater uses, and that is primarily irrigation. And so I haven't quantified that yet, but I should talk to facilities to find out their irrigation schedule and get some numbers to put on the other side of my groundwater accounting equation. And last question.
Okay, since California's climate has been warming, and we know that the southern San Joaquin Valley is in worse shape as far as water is concerned, do you see any evidence in the agricultural industry that if some of these crops are being grown further north, or would that be a possible solution to shift some of these water-intensive crops further north as the climate warms, maybe it would be viable?
So the question is asking, with climate change, as California is warming, would the wetter parts of Northern California become viable growing locations for these thirsty crops that have been traditionally grown in the South? And the answer to that is, I don't know exactly how rapidly how much change in climate the crops need in order to be viable to the north. There are also local issues where communities' economies are depending on those crops being in the south. So if you shift them to the north, then that also shifts the economic drivers to the north. But as to whether or not climate change will make Northern California a more viable location for crops, I don't know, but that's a good question. All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed speaking to you tonight.